Actually, to quite a degree, we found that the clearing of the reservoir helped us because otherwise it was quite difficult to find sites in the valley bottom itself. And while many sites were damaged a bit, it wasn't extensive, and much of the clearing was done in the wintertime when the ground was frozen, and that helped to lessen the damage as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, as I mentioned, we looked at the cultivated fields, and we used the usual archaeological techniques of simply walking the fields with people parallel to one another. Anytime artifacts are found on the surface, they're flagged, and then we would go back and study these sites, map them where each artifact is, and probably put in some test holes to see if there's any buried, undisturbed archaeological occupation at these locations.
I was going to ask you about that. If you did check the subsurface of these sites.
We did consistently. Every one of these sites had a line of test holes put through it.
Which we see here.
Which we see here. And in some cases, we couldn't look at the surface because something was in a hayfield, as in this particular case. And so we put a line of test holes, but we would put a line of test holes through in any case.
Now, as I understand it, this was, these test holes were also the procedure that you used for testing in the forested areas as well.
Yes, in the forested areas, however, we didn't know where the sites were, so the technique that we eventually developed was simply to take the edge of a terrace or the edge of a stream running into the river, the edge of a stream bank, and put a line of test holes along it, and we found that to be quite an effective manner of finding sites in areas which were still forested. And there were some areas that were not cleared that we had to deal with as well and find sites in. We also had a statistically based sampling program that we carried out in the reservoir. It wasn't, however, so much oriented to help us to find sites as simply so we could have some information at the end telling us how many sites should actually be in the valley, and then we looked at how many we actually found, and to have an idea whether the two compared or not.
I see.
As well, to some extent, what sites occurred in what environmental zones, whether they were down on the floodplain on the bottom of the valley, whether they were on terraces on the valley side or up on the valley rim up on top.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's get to some of the sites that you found and some of the artifacts you found.
Well, I should perhaps indicate first that the numbers of sites which we eventually found and recorded were quite high. We have on record something like 280 sites or find areas. Our statistical survey suggested that there should be something over 300, so we are approaching the total find of sites in the valley. At least we're approaching it. Mm-hmm. We excavated something like 24 sites. I mean, we sat down at sites and did fairly detailed excavation at them. That's the most time-consuming and expensive part of this sort of work is this detailed excavation. Yeah. One of the sites that we did excavate is the Crown site, which we see here on the slide. And it's at the mouth of a creek which runs into the Saskatchewan River. And this area, as shown in this slide, has been cleared of trees, except that we asked the clear cutters to leave the trees at the site itself.
So that explains the little brush standing up there.
Clump of brush there. And we had very good cooperation with SaskPower and the clear cutters throughout this. Now, coming down to the site itself, the excavation ran over 2 seasons. We had initially thought, on the basis of our little test holes, that it was quite shallow. it actually extended down for going on 2 meters in places.
Was this a common depth for sites in the Nipawin area?
Not really. Most of our sites were more shallow than this. We only had 2 or 3 that went to a depth of 1.5 meters or 2 meters.
Still looks like quite an operation, though. Yeah.
Quite a number of people and screens and mechanical screens in operation at this particular site.
Now, what was interesting about this particular site?
This site went back to the McKean period of our earliest radiocarbon date there was 4,300 years ago, and that's a pretty typical McKean date for Saskatchewan. This was the period when the climate was a bit warmer and the parkland zone had moved farther north, so the people at this period were living in an area in which there were bison herds, and these were buffalo hunters. The McKean people made characteristic, what we call lanceolate points, which you can see on the slide here. These are not side notch, but they do have quite a deep V notch in the base, and that's the characteristic McKean style.
These were a dart point, not an
They're not arrowheads, they're dart points, probably by darts we mean a small spear, 5 feet long perhaps, propelled with a throwing board. One of the very interesting finds in this, actually there's a series of McKean occupations, 3 or 4 there over several centimeters, is this little marine shell, and it's of a dentalium, which comes from the British Columbia or American northwestern coast. It's from the Pacific coast. And dentalium were a highly prized marine shell that were traded inland, but to the best of my knowledge, this is the earliest dated example in Saskatchewan.
It'd be interesting to know what they traded back to get this, this
right.
little bit of shell.
We don't know. Another interesting recovery from this ancient McKean level were the bones of a couple of dogs. These people had dogs with them, and here we see the fragments of the skull of one of them, a young dog that apparently had died and was left at the site. Above the McKean levels at the Crown site was the Hanna occupations, and again there were multiple, more than one Hanna occupations represented. And as you can see, by this time period, the projectile points, the dart points, have changed in style, and they have this side notch or corner notch, quite different from that of the preceding McKean occupation at this particular site. And these are dating around 3,400, 3,600 years ago at this particular site.
Do these two cultures represent the earliest known occupation of the Nipawin area?
Not by any means. They are, however, among the earliest cultural groups that we excavated material of. From the surface of the cultivated fields, we do have materials which stylistically we know are older. We have materials going back to what is called the Paleo-Indian period of 7,000 to 7,500 years ago. But we date them stylistically by reference to excavations elsewhere, not at Nipawin.
Okay, but it's obvious people have been running around there for quite some time then.
Yes, and in the Nipawin to Prince Albert region, there are even older materials of the Alberta and Cody complex periods, which could easily be 8,000 to 8,500 years ago.
Okay.